بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد خير الأولين والآخرين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم زدنا ولا تنقصنا وأكرمنا ولا تهنا وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وارض عنا وأرضنا ويا رب العالمين. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And welcome back to the study of Sheikh Abdulrahman ibn al-Jawzi's al-Khatir, which we've entitled Retaining Spiritual Insights, a particular book which can be translated as The Hunt for Ideas or The Hunt for Thoughts, in that the author himself, as explained before, decided that it was important for him to write down many of his reflections, which he had the tendency to forget throughout the day, and so that he could later benefit from those reflections and also share those reflections with other people. He decided that it would be good for him to write these things down. So he wrote this book, a very extensive book. Of course, as mentioned before, due to the fact that Ramadan is just basically numbered days, it won't be possible for us to read the entire book. But I wanted to, of course, read from certain selections, and we've been reading from the very beginning of the book. So at the beginning of the plan for this particular list of a series of lessons, I actually originally was planning to jump around a little bit, but the book itself has been so interesting that I have found no reason to actually skip any particular part of the book. So the last section we dealt with was the section where he talked about the ulama of the dunya and the ulama of the akhirah. And he wanted to, or rather, he highlighted that one of the fundamental difference between what he calls, of course, the ulama of the dunya and the ulama of the akhirah, is that the ulama of the dunya are people who are constantly in competition with others of the same particular field of specialization. There's a tendency to be a lot of shared envy and jealousy between them, a lot of anger, a lot of course, very negative competition attempts to undermine one another. Whereas with regard to the ulama of the akhirah, these are people who are very much happy to see their brothers get ahead. They don't act less like crabs in the barrel. Rather, these individuals who ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they remove from them any particular rancor in their hearts that they have for others when they find others have been blessed with certain things by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which they themselves have not been blessed with. And so one particular verse which he quoted is in Surah Al-Hashar, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is quoting the Ansar, is saying, وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ, or rather the people who came after the early community, وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم. And those who came after them, they said, "O Lord, forgive us and forgive our brothers who came before us, those who preceded us in faith, and do not place in our hearts any rancor for those who came before us, or for any rancors for those who believe." And so that itself is the proper attitude for the ulama of the akhirah. So I thought it would probably be nice to start there, but also start with a particular story, an important story. And this particular story concerns both Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim. And of course, we know the status of Imam al-Bukhari and Muslim among Ahlul Sunnah, right? Imam Bukhari celebrated having the most important book after the Quran in the Ummah, and then Muslim, of course, having the second most important book after the Quran, his Sahih of Imam Muslim. And the interesting part of this, it relates to the life of Imam Bukhari. Now, when we think about the fact that Imam Bukhari is widely accepted today, that one would think that this was always the case throughout his history. But actually, it turns out that Imam al-Bukhari, despite his fame and his authority in the Ummah in the very early days, he was originally driven out of his own hometown, Bukhara. He was driven out of Bukhara, and he went to Iraq. He was driven out of Iraq. And then eventually he made himself to Nisabur, and then even was driven out of Nisabur, which is really interesting, right, for different reasons. And quite often it was because of many of the people, the local scholars, who they didn't like certain beliefs that Imam al-Bukhari had. And so I wanted to focus on just the story about Nisabur, because Nisabur is the town or the hometown of Imam Muslim, rahmatullah alayhi. And when Imam al-Bukhari had visited Nisabur, the most important scholar in that town was known as Muhammad bin Yahya al-Dhuhli, right, who was actually one of the teachers of Imam Muslim. That he was the man, right? He was really just, everyone gravitated to him. Imam Bukhari had developed a name for himself even before him arriving in Nisabur, as was the case when he went to Iraq. Before he arrived in Iraq, he is known to be this individual, a very masterful person, a person of great intellect, of great memory, a vast memory. So when Imam al-Bukhari visited Nisabur, Imam al-Dhuhli, who was the Sheikh of Imam Muslim, he actually encouraged his students to go learn from Imam al-Bukhari. So Imam al-Bukhari, he's teaching, and so crowds upon crowds of people, they come to hear Imam al-Bukhari in his hadith circle and the other things that he'd been teaching. But it becomes such an issue that many of the students of Imam al-Dhuhli stopped attending his own circle, right? So Imam al-Dhuhli comes out one day to teach, and notices that the crowds, or the typical crowds that he would have in a circle, were not there. But then he got word that the Imam al-Bukhari was actually the one who all these people were being entertained by. And of course, this is not to say that this is really the fundamental reason why what happened, in the future, which I'm actually going to explain right now. But of course, it is listed by certain scholars, who say that, okay, there was a type of jealousy developed by Imam al-Dhuhli in light of him seeing the followers, or the number of students of his dwindle during the sojourn of Imam Bukhari while he was in Nisabur. And Imam Muslim himself would also go learn from Imam Bukhari. He would learn from Imam al-Dhuhli. And so eventually what happened, a particular controversy developed related to the question of whether or not the Quran was created. Imam al-Bukhari was asked a question about this issue. He gave an answer that some people took advantage of, and he said that Imam al-Dhuhli himself also did not give it the best construction, did not give Imam Bukhari the benefit of the doubt. And then he told all of the students to stop attending his circle. A lot of people became very angry with Imam Bukhari, and then eventually Imam Bukhari was driven out of Nisabur as well. And so again, the part of this to highlight, again, what makes Bukhari in particular an example of the ulama of the akhirah, is that interestingly, that Imam Muslim, he left the circle of Imam al-Dhuhli, and once he published his Sahih of Imam Muslim, in that book, he doesn't report any hadith from his own sheikh, Imam Dhuhli. Now, of course, one can argue that he also doesn't report any hadith from Imam Bukhari either, right? So in that sense, Imam Muslim, he actually avoided quoting hadith from both of the scholars. Imam al-Bukhari, on the other hand, in his Sahih, despite the controversy and the clash he had with Imam al-Dhuhli, he actually reports more than 40 hadith which originate from Imam al-Dhuhli in his Sahih, although he reports them with what is called a tadlis, right? In other words, tadlis was a particular approach that scholars would take when they related a hadith, when they attempted to obscure the source of the actual statement out of fear that those actually listening would not accept the hadith from them, right? So Imam al-Bukhari, he typically, when he relates a hadith from Imam Muhammad bin Yahya al-Dhuhli, he actually relates it in a way that the average reader would not know that he's taking the hadith directly from him, right? So in other words, Imam Bukhari felt that it was what he learned from Imam al-Dhuhli, the hadith that he had, memorized and heard from Imam Zuhri was so important to be heard that he had to include them in his own Sahih. But he also was fearful that a certain people who knew about the incident and the grudge that Imam al-Zuhli was reported to have had against Imam al-Bukhari would not accept the reports. So he himself, he obscured Imam al-Zuhli's name, right, in the Isnad itself, over more than 40 hadith in the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, right? In other words, Imam al-Bukhari was one of the ulama of the Akhirah. And so as we listed, yesterday we saw just a number of scholars talking about how they prayed for this scholar. Imam Ahmed talked about how Imam Shafi'i was one of the 6 people that he prayed for every single night before he went to bed, or before Salat al-Fajr, after Tahajjud, etc. Right? In other words, that's what we're told to do. That when you feel jealous of someone, then you should pray for that person, right? Or at least you should seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the accursed shaitan, right? So today I want to begin in this particular section, which is entitled "Fi anna tasfiyat al-ahwali bi tasfiyat al-a'mali." The purity of states or conditions is determined by the purity of one's actions. And what's intended by the title is this idea that there's a metaphysical connection between what we do and the conditions we live under in our lives, right? In other words, that if you act in a certain way, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make your life a certain way. And if you act, in violation to the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will turn things in a different way. And so we find in the Quran itself, there are 2 verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He indicates this. One of them, the most famous verse, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim, that Allah, He doesn't change what is with the people until they change what is with themselves, which gives the impression that, of course, that if you want to do better, if you want a better life, then you should make an effort to change who you are. Right. And then another verse in Surah Al-Anfal, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ لَمْ يَكُنْ مُغَيِّرًا نِعْمَةً أَنْعَمَهَا عَلَىٰ قَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. And that is because Allah, He does not alter a blessing that He has conferred upon a people until they change what is with themselves. In other words, if you're in a good state, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't remove or change that good state to a bad state until you change something with your behavior, right? So, in other words, the title basically is saying that your behavior will determine the outcomes in your life. So then he begins and he says, "Man ahabba tasfiyat al-ahwali falyajtahid fi tasfiyat al-a'mali." Whoever wants to improve their conditions, then let them improve their conduct. قال الله عز وجل وَأَلَّا وَاسْتَقَامُوا عَلَى الطَّرِيقَةِ لَأَسْقَيْنَاهُمْ مَاءً غَدَقًا. And he quotes from Surah Al-Jinn, where it says, and if they had walked straight upon the path, then we would send down to them abundant rain. In other words, as a result of their righteousness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send down upon them abundant rain. And of course, with abundant rain, you have abundant sustenance. It makes the fruit, it makes the vegetables grow, it makes the everything, the vegetation, everything that we need to grow. Of course, your animals eat from the fodder and the field itself. They fatten themselves too. So we have not only access to the fruits and to the vegetables, but also to the meat that we eat when we slaughter the animals. In other words, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, if you were to walk upright, if they were to walk upright, then Allah would send down to them abundant rain. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فيما يروي عن ربه عز وجل لو أن عبادي أطاعوني لسقيتهم المطر بالليل وأطلعت عليهم الشمس بالنهار ولم أسمعهم صوت الرعد. And so then he quotes this hadith. And so before I translated it, I just wanted to indicate that this particular hadith itself is considered to be weak according to the scholars, but, just a reflection on the meaning. So he said, the Prophet said concerning what he related from his Lord. So this itself is called a hadith Qudsi. It is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says Allah said something which is not from the Quran. So according to this hadith, Allah said, if my servants were to obey me, then I would grant them rain during the nighttime, and I would make the sun shine over them during the daytime, and I would not allow for them to hear the sound of thunder. In other words, to make us fearful, right? So this hadith was again, if my servants had obeyed me, I would grant them rain during the nighttime, and I would make the sun shine over them during the daytime, and I would not allow for them to hear the sound of thunder. Again, it's a hadith of the Prophet, rather a hadith which the ulama say is da'if. So of course we don't say that the Prophet said it. Rather we say it is attributed to the Prophet, or we always indicate that anytime you relate a hadith which is weak, you always have to indicate to the listener that this may not be something that the Prophet ﷺ actually said. It may be something one of the Sahaba said. It may be something that one of the early prophets said, but we really can't say for certain. But it contains a wisdom that is perhaps an eternal, a transhistorical wisdom, and so we are allowed to benefit from those wisdoms. And basically, is a hadith which is encouraging us to do something good. And so the ulama said that anytime a hadith is in the category of what is called fada'il al-a'mal, the hadith which encourage virtuous action, then it is permissible to act upon it, right? But in any hadith which is classified as da'if, we never say expressly the Prophet ﷺ said this. So even though Imam Ibn al-Jawzi was himself one of the great hadith masters, that he himself made a lot of mistakes as well when it came to the reporting of hadith. And so this is an example, one of those hadiths which is not considered to be sound. But then he also quotes another one. He says, وَقَالَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ الْبِرُّ لَا يَبْلَى وَالْإِثْمُ لَا يُنْسَى وَالدَّيَّانُ لَا يَنَامُ كَمَا تُدِينُ تُدَانُ. Again, another hadith that the scholars differ about its authenticity. And so he goes on and said, the Prophet said, righteousness does not wither. Righteousness never withers. Sin is never forgotten, and the judge never sleeps. As you judge, so shall you be judged. Again, righteousness does not wither. Sin is never forgotten. The judge never sleeps. And as you judge, so shall you be judged. So, an important hadith, and basically, once again, suggesting the idea that if you do bad things, then bad things are going to happen to you. وقال أبو سليمان الداراني من صفي له ومن قدر قدر عليه. According to a great scholar from the early period, Abu Sulaiman al-Darani, whoever seeks purification, purity will be made for him. In other words, whoever seeks to rectify his behavior, then Allah will rectify his condition in the world. وَمَنْ قَدَّرَ قُدِّرَ عَلَيْهِ. And whoever pollutes himself, then pollution will become his lot. In other words, if you do bad things, then your lot, your conditions in your life will become bad as well. وَمَنْ أَحْسَنَ فِي لَيْلِهِ كُفِيَ فِي نَهَارِهِ. And whoever does good during the nighttime, then all of his needs will be taken care of during the daytime. In other words, if you stand in prayer in tahajjud at night, in the daytime, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the things that you need. وَمَنْ أَحْسَنَ فِي نَهَارِهِ كُفِيَ فِي لَيْلِهِ. And whoever does well during the daytime, his needs will be taken care of during the nighttime. So it's sort of a metaphysical connection between good deeds and good outcomes. This is a belief that many Muslims in the perhaps we can say even most of Islamic history, that they had the understanding that when things weren't going well, it was probably because of something we did wrong. And if things were going good, then we're probably doing well, except that we should not deceive ourselves. And then he goes on, he says, وَكَانَ شَيْخٌ يَدُورُ فِي الْمَجَالِسِ وَيَقُولُ مَنْ سَرَّهُ أَن تَدُومَ لَهُ الْعَافِيَةُ فَيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. So there was a sheikh who used to walk and pass by the different assemblies of dhikr in different places where people would gather, and he used to say, whoever wants whoever is made happy by having a permanent state of well-being, then let that person fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَل لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. That whoever has taqwa for Allah, Allah will make it out for him. وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. And he will provide for him from a place where he doesn't expect. Right? So that's what the Quran says. Right? So in other words, there is great truth. This is a great truth that we need to consider. وكان فضيل بن عياض يقول إني لعصي الله فأعرف ذلك في خلق دابتي وجاريتي. It says, Fudayl ibn Ayyad, he used to say, when anytime I disobey God, anytime I disobey Allah, I know that I have disobeyed Allah, and I notice it revealed, manifesting in the character, the conduct of my animals and my servants. In other words, if, say, for instance, he has a horse and the horse refuses to obey him, or a dog, for instance, if you had a guard dog, for instance, for his crops, his livestock, and refuses to obey him, he would accuse himself and say, I must have committed a sin. Now, if his servants are not obeying him, he said, I must have committed a sin, right? Said, when I notice if my children are not obeying me, it has to be because I've done something wrong. So this itself is Allah's way of purging me of those sins, right? Or at least directed me to think about what those things are, and then commit myself to Tawbah for those things. واعلم وفقك الله أنه لا يحس بضربة مبنج وإنما يعرف زيادة من النقصان المحاسب لنفسه. So, and know, may Allah guide you, that a person who actually has been given an anesthesia, a person in a state of anesthesia does not feel a hit when someone strikes him, right? And only someone who actually is taking account of himself will notice increase and decrease. In other words, in the same way that a person who does business, at the end of the day, you do accounting, of everything that you sold, and you can tell if have I profited, have I not profited, has my stockpile of commodities, have they increased or to decrease, right? So, or in particular, we're talking about profit. That's typically the muhasib will do. ومتى رأيت تقديرا في حال فاذكر نعمة ما شكرت أو زلة قد فعلت وزلة قد فعلت زلة قد فعلت. And so anytime you notice your life sort of spiraling out of order, or you notice things not going your way in life, then you should remember at that moment some particular blessing that you have for which you have not shown proper gratitude, or you should think about some particular sin that you committed, right? So in other words, that blame yourself. First of all, when things are not going well, when things are not going right, blame yourself. Think about, accuse yourself of not being grateful for all of the blessings that Allah has given you, or some blessing that Allah has not given you, or some sin that you have done and you have not made tawbah for. واحذر من نفار النعم ومفاجأة النقم ولا تغتر بالسعة بساط الحلم فَرُبَّمَا عَاجِلَ انقباضه. It said, and beware of the flight of blessings, and beware of the sudden strike of affliction. Right? So beware of the flight of blessings and the sudden strike of affliction. So be on guard against that. And do not be deluded by your good state. Right? Do not be deluded by the fact that you're in a state of forbearance and luxury, right? Because that particular state may change quickly. It may change quickly. وقد قال الله عز وجل إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. And then he quotes the ayah from where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, verily Allah, He doesn't change what is with the people until or unless they change what is with themselves. وكان أبو عدي الرضباني يقول من الاغترار أن تسيء فيحسن إليك فتترك التوبة توهما أنك تسامح في الهفوات. He says, so Abu Ali al-Rudbari, a great Iraqi scholar, mystic, he said, it is a sign of delusion for you to do wrong and then Allah treat you well, as you know, despite you doing wrong, and then you abandon Tawbah thinking that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has overlooked your wrong. He said that itself was a sign of delusion, that you do something wrong, punishment doesn't happen to you, and because of it, you don't do Tawbah because you imagine that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually has overlooked the things that you've done that are wrong. Rather, you should be on guard and wait that, that again, the flight of the blessings and the sudden affliction with sudden strike of the afflictions. In the next section is entitled في وجوب التسليم بحكمة الخالق سواء أدركها العقل أم لا. So the next section concerns the obligation of surrendering to God's wisdom, regardless of whether or not you're able to comprehend why or comprehend what the wisdom is. In other words, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He placed an expectation upon you, there's a tendency, of course, especially as adults to say, well, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this compulsory? Why did Allah say that this is haram? So basically you say, okay, well, it's important, or rather it is a compulsory for us to embrace or to accept God's wisdom, right? When it comes to His legislation, or even when He decrees things, right? So he goes on, he says, تفكرت يوما في التكليف فرأيته ينقسم إلى سهل وصعب. Said one day I thought about the fact that Allah, He places religious burdens upon us. And I noticed that some religious burdens are easy and some are difficult. فأما السهل فهو أعمال جوارح إلا أن منه ما هو أصعب من بعض. As for the easy form of burdens, those are the actions of the limbs of the body, except that some of them are harder than others. فالوضوء والصلاة أسهل من الصوم والصوم ربما كان عند قوم أسهل من الزكاة. It says wudu and salah are easier than fasting. And fasting, it might be for some people easier than zakat. وأما الصعب فيتفاوت فبعضها أصعب من بعض. As for the hard burdens that Allah placed upon them, they are disparate as well, but some of them are harder than others. فمن المستصعب النظر والاستدلال الموصلان إلى معرفة الخالق فهذا صعب عند من غلبت عليه أمور الحس سهل عند أهل العقل. It said, as for the most difficult are things like reflection, the type of reflection which leads us to knowledge of God. In other words, theological reflection, right? Rational reflection about matters of theology. He said that this is perhaps the most difficult of all of the religious burdens placed upon us. In other words, what is the rational evidence of God's existence, right? What is the rational evidence of God's attributes, right, etc., things like that. He said that this is difficult for those upon whom the matters of the five senses, the senses overwhelm that individual's makeup, but it's easy for the people who actually are very rational, very highly intelligent people. In other words, people who have the knack for matters of rationality as opposed to those who are not. ومن المستصعب غلبة الهوى وقهر النفوس وكف الطباع عن التصرف فيما يؤثر. Then he also says another example of something extremely difficult is gaining mastery over one's lust and subduing oneself, one's ego, and restraining the hands of nature, which from actually being able to meddle in the things that they prefer. Right. In other words, to resist one's passions, right? It's very difficult to resist one's passions, right? We have passion for eat, for drink, for intercourse. We sometimes we get angry, we get fearful. He said that this itself is also one of the most difficult of all the burdens, because Allah, He calls us to restrain ourselves, constrain our lusts, right? وَكُلُّ هَذَا يَسْهُرُ عَلَى الْعَاقِلِ النظر في ثوابه ورجاء عاقبته وإن شق عاجلا. It said, but all of this is easy for the intelligent person who actually looks at the reward and the hope of the final consequence of those things, even if they're very difficult in the immediate present itself, right? So right now they're difficult, but when we reflect upon the long-term benefits of those things, then the intelligent person, this actually becomes easy for them to deal with. وإنما أصعب التكاليف وعجبها أنه قد ثبتت حكمة خالق عند العقل. It said, but it then goes and says the most difficult of all of the burdens, the most difficult and the most amazing of them, is that is established that God has wisdom, or the God's wisdom exists with respect to many different things, right? So the mind accepts this concept, this idea, this assumption, or this proposition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has great wisdom, and everything that He does has wisdom, right? So that is the first thing. So it said it becomes the most difficult. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so the mind accepts that God has wisdom. ثم نراه يفكر متشاغلا بالعلم المقبل على عبادة حتى يعضه فقر بناجذيه فيذل للجاهل في طلب القوت. So the mind accepts that Allah is al-Hakim. He's the most wise. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has wisdom. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He decrees things, there's great wisdom there. Why does He give to some people? Why does He take from some other people? Why does He give life? Why does He take life? Why does He make some strong? Why does He make some weak? Right? That the mind accepts this idea that everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is wise. But then at the same time, one notices that Allah sometimes will actually make someone who's preoccupied with knowledge and engrossed in ibadah, make the person impoverished to the point that poverty bites him with his teeth, right, with both of his teeth, to the extent that that particular person actually now has to humble himself and degrade himself in the presence of a person who's uneducated in order to seek one's own provision and nourishment. In other words, a scholar, or a devotee to God is engrossed in worship. One person is committed to learning, right? Actually, it turns out that that person, despite doing the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately wants us to do, he becomes impoverished and then has to now subject himself to humiliation by going to someone who's not educated and seeking their provision and the risk from that person. وَيُغْنِي الْفَاسِقَ مَعَ جَهْلِ حَتَّى تَفِيدَ الدُّنْيَا عَلَيْهِ. In other words, so again, Allah is wise, the mind accepts that. But then we struggle with understanding why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala impoverish the learned and enrich the unlearned? Why does He impoverish the depraved person, despite of that depraved person's lack of knowledge, to the extent that the dunya itself sort of like overflows, right? All the benefits of the dunya opened up and overflow to the benefit of that individual. Right? So it's like so the mind struggles with this, right? So they say, well, how is this? Allah is wise, but He's done this. In other words, we're left to sort of maybe challenge, okay, what's the wisdom of that? Or this may not be wise, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And in some ways, this is the same sort of thinking that Iblis, la'natullah alayhi, had when it came to Allah ordering the angels to prostrate before Him. So it said, prostrate to Adam alayhi salam, and Iblis says, no, I'm better than him, created me from fire, created him from clay, right? In other words, the suggestion is that if there is anyone more entitled to the angel's prostration, it would be me, right? Not him. He hasn't proven himself. I can see that. Why can't you see it? In other words, he's questioning Allah's wisdom, right? So sometimes we may feel like we're questioning Allah's wisdom too. We say, well, I'm doing all the right things. That person is doing nothing right, but Allah has given him the dunya, and He's not giving me any of it. ثم نراه ينشئ الأجسام ويحكمها ثم ينقض بناء الشباب في مبدأ أمره وعند استكمال بنائه فإذا به قد عاد هشيما. So we also notice Allah that He will help have some people's bodies develop and become strong, right? We see people in very good shape, right? And then at the same time, he will pretty much demolish the youth of some people right at the start of their lives, or at the end of their full adulthood, right? Once their particular physical body develops completely, then all of a sudden they're afflicted with some illness, and all of a sudden, as if like now they start to wither and turn brittle, right? Immediately. So in other words, we see Allah do this to people. Some people gives them perfect bodies, if we would say, perfect health, right? Very strong bodies. Others, He decides, you know what? You're not going to have good health right from the start. Or after you become an adult, Allah decides to afflict that person with something that makes their body brittle. ثم نراه يؤلم الأطفال حتى يرحمه كل طبع ثم يقال له إياك أن تشك في أنه أرحم الراحمين. So this is where it kind of ends. So this is like, okay, this is the most difficult of all of the religious burdens placed upon us. That one, the mind is fine. It accepts the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wisdom and everything He does is wise, right? But then we notice He brings pain to infant children to the extent that every person feels compassion when they see a child in pain. But then we're told, beware that you doubt that Allah is the most merciful of all those who show mercy. Right? In other words, so it's like, okay, well, your mind says, say, well, where's the mercy? Right? But it's like, okay, and so He's saying, well, this is the most difficult. This is why it's the most difficult. It's like, well, it's like, how can it be? He's wise, most wise, but then He brings pain on innocent people, right? It means pain. He actually makes weak the strong weak, who have committed no wrong. ثم يسمع بإرسال موسى إلى فرعون ويقال له اعتقد أن الله تعالى أضل فرعون. They said, then one hears that Allah sent Moses to Pharaoh. And then we hear afterwards someone say, you must believe that Allah, he guaranteed that Pharaoh would be misguided. In other words, it's like, well, if Allah was responsible for Pharaoh's misguidance, then why did He send Musa to talk to Pharaoh when Allah knew that Pharaoh himself would never accept? So it's like, well, this is difficult to wrap our minds around it. وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ مَا كَانَ لِآدَمَ بُدَّ مِنْ أَكْلِ الشَّجَرَةِ وَقَدْ وُبِّخَ بِقَوْلِهِ عَصَى آدَمُ رَبَّهُ. It said, and we also may hear something like, or rather we may hear it said and know that Adam, that one needs to know, we need to acknowledge that Adam, he couldn't avoid eating from the tree, right? In other words, it was inevitable that Adam was going to eat here from the tree, despite the fact that Allah, He scolds him in the Quran saying Adam disobeyed his Lord. In other words, it's like, well, why scold Adam if you know that Adam couldn't help but to eat from the tree, right? Right. So, وفي مثل هذه الأشياء تحير خلق حتى خرجوا إلى الكفر والتكذيب. It said, and under such scenarios and with respect to such things, many people have fallen in confusion and even have been led into kufr, have been led into disbelief as a result of these particular questions. So they said that this is the most difficult of all the burdens. وَلَوْ فَتَّشُوا عَلَى سِرِّ هذه الأشياء لَعَلِمُوا أَنَّ تَسْلِيمَ هذه الأمور تكليف العقل ليذعن. He said, and if they were to search deeply into the secret of all of these things, then one would know, or rather they would know, that surrender to these matters is a religious burden placed upon the human mind so that the mind would submit. In other words, so our limbs submit to things. If Allah tells us to pray, we pray. If He tells us to fast, we fast. If He tells us to give zakat, we give zakat. That's easy. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells our minds to surrender to certain ideas, that itself is a bit more challenged. But He says that, well, the path forward is to just simply surrender. You say, listen, okay, well, Allah is still a Hakim, even if I don't fully understand why. He tells me I must believe this and also accept that, and believe this and also accept that, right? So Allah, He wants our minds to surrender, to be burdened to surrender to the things that He places upon us to embrace and believe in. وَهَذَا أَصْلٌ إِذَا فُهِمَ حَصَلَ مِنْهُ السَّلَامَةُ وَالتَّسْلِيمُ. And so this itself is a principle. If it is understood, then safety and well-being and peace itself will be achieved as a result of it. نسأل الله عز وجل أن يكشف لنا الغوامض التي حيرت من ضل إنه قريب مجيد. And then he makes a prayer. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal that He expose for us all of the obscure things that cause confusion to those who are led astray or those who go astray, because He is close to us and He answers our prayers. He answers our prayers. And so this last section I want to cover today is somewhat long. Sorry, 1 second. I just wanted to plug in my charger, make sure that things don't turn off. All right, there you go. All right, so this final section is entitled Qimat al-Waqt, the value of time. Right, it's somewhat long, but I think it's really extremely beneficial. So he says, ينبغي للإنسان أن يعرف شرف زمانه وقدر وقته. Well, maybe this is not the section I'm thinking of. So they actually may. Let me see. Make sure. No, actually, this is not that section. At any rate, so this is a different section than I thought it was. But here, the value of time. ينبغي للإنسان يعرف شرف زمانه وقدر وقته فلا يضيع منه لحظة في غير قربه ويقدم الأفضل فالأفضل من القول والعمل. It said it is appropriate for a person, or rather a person should know the value of his time, and he should not waste one moment doing anything other than something that would bring him close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That he should do that which is most superior, followed by that which is next in line in superiority, be there a statement or an action. So you should say things that are great. If they're not the greatest of things, you say things that are good, right? Or if you do things that are great, and then if you're not great, then do things that are good. So in other words, al-afdal fal-afdal. وَلْتَكُنْ نِيَّتُهُ فِي الْخَيْرِ قَائِمَةً مِنْ غَيْرِ فُتُورٍ بِمَا لَا يَعْزِزُ عَنْهُ بَدَنُ مِنَ الْعَمَلِ كما جاء في الحديث نية المؤمن خير من عمله. So let one's niyyah be, right? Let one's niyyah be that one shall embark upon good, the type of good that one's body is capable of carrying out on a regular basis. And it says that start with the niyyah. Why? Because of the hadith, the niyyah of the believer is better than his work. Again, this is another hadith whose authenticity is disputed, but he mentions it. It's quoted quite often, and he says, وَقَدْ كَانَ جَمَاعَةٌ مِنَ السَّلَفِ يُبَادِرُونَ اللَّحَظَاتِ ونقل عن عامر بن عبد القيس أن رجلا قال له كلمني. So it says a group of the predecessors, they should take full advantage of their free time. So it's related about a man known as Amr ibn Abd al-Qais, that someone had come to him and said to him, Kellimni, talk to me. And so Amr said to him, Amsik al-Shams, stop the sun. In other words, or hold the sun. Right? Hold the sun from moving. The idea being that if you want me to talk to you, you should stop time. Stop time for me, so that I can spend wasting time talking to you. And that's the whole idea. وقال ابن ثابت البناني ذهبت ألقن أبي فقال يا بني دعني فإني في ورد السادس. He says, Ibn Thabit al-Bunani, or the son of Thabit al-Bunani, Thabit al-Bunani, one of the great tabi'in, he said that his son came to him and said, I came to seek a lesson from my father, or to offer a lesson to my father. And my father said to me, oh, my son, leave me alone. I'm completing my sixth litany. My wird sadis, my sixth litany. In other words, he's involved with dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm finishing that right now, right? So leave me alone. Let me take full advantage of the time that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me on this earth. ودخلوا على بعض السلف عند موته وهو يصلي فقيل له فقال الآن تطبع صحيفتي. So a group of people, they entered in the presence of one of our predecessors at the time of his death while he was praying. And once he finished praying, someone said to him something. He said, now my book or my record of good deeds, my record of deeds can now be closed, right? Meaning that this is the final act in this dunya. فإذا علم الإنسان وإن بالغ في الجد بأن الموت يقطعه عن العمل عمل في حياته ما يدوم له أجره بعد موته. So whenever a person knows, regardless of how serious they may be, once you know that death is something that may cut you off from your work, then that person shall work during his life doing things that will bring eternal benefit and reward for him after his death. فإن كان له شيء من الدنيا وقف وقفا وغرس غرسا وأجرى نهرا ويسعى في تحصيل ذرية تذكر الله بعده فيكون الأجر له. It said, then that person, if it happens to be something from this world, then that person will establish an endowment, or they will plant some type of vegetation or source of food that someone can benefit from, or he will dig a canal, or he will pursue marriage and children, and the pursuit of children who will remember Allah, mention Allah after he dies, and he himself will get the reward of that. أو أن يصنف كتابا في العلم فإن تصنيف العالم ولده مخلد. Or the person will write a book of knowledge, because the publishment of a book by a scholar is his child who will eternalize him. وَلَدُهُ مُخَلِّدٌ. It is his child would grant him eternal benefit. وَأَنْ يَكُونَ عَامِلًا بِالْخَيْرِ عَالِمًا فِيهِ. Or one should be someone who actually does good things and actually acts, who has knowledge of what he is doing. فَيَنْقُلَ مِنْ فِعْلِهِ مَا يَقْتَدِي الْغَيْرُ بِهِ فَلِذَلِكَ الَّذِي لَمْ يَمُتْ. So if a يُنْقَلُ مِنْ فِعْلِهِ, so a person just simply just act righteously, and act in accord with one's knowledge. And when one does that, then it will be related, it will be transmitted about the person, all the good things that he's done, and others will emulate him in that. And for that particular reason, such a person will not die. We will never die. قَدْ مَاتَ قَوْمٌ وَهُمْ فِي النَّاسِ أَحْيَاءٌ. And as the statement goes, some people die, but they remain alive among the people. You remain alive. Why? You remain alive among people because of all of the good that you have left behind. All the good that you left behind. At any rate, I think probably that's a good place to pause today. Once again, offer an opportunity to ask any questions. If you don't have any questions, that's always good as well. But please do support the Lamppost Education Initiative. We're trying to raise money here. Once again, this month of Ramadan. This is a labor of love for all of us. Lamppost does quite a bit, even though, of course, it doesn't require a lot to do so. Please do donate generously. Please help us to continue our efforts. And if there are no questions, I haven't seen anyone write anything. So if there are no questions, I think we can conclude here. As usual, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your fasts, accept your prayers, accept your reading and recitation of the Quran, accept your charity during this month, and may He multiply all of the good that you've done, and may He spare you from the fire of Jahannam, and also do the same thing for your loved ones, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.